Welcome to MyCo Minute, conversations about collaboration brought to you by the capacity creators at MyCo Consulting, LLC, where we help higher ed, nonprofit, and philanthropic leaders advance the initiatives they care about most.
Welcome back to MyCo Minute. This is Deb Mashek, and I am delighted today to be joined by not one, but two guests, both of whom are with the Gardner Institute. And first up is Vicki McGillin. Vicki, you're in retirement, but this is quite a CV. So after retiring as provost and professor of psychology, so we share that psychology background, at Otterbein University, Vicki went on to become a fellow with the Gardner Institute, and her areas of expertise are legend. So we've got student retention, academic advising, gateways to completion, and Vicki led the curricular and programmatic and business collaborations through the Association of Independent Colleges and Universities of Ohio. And I looked that up, and there are 52 institutions as part of that consortium. So you know how to juggle consortial balls. So we'll definitely be picking up that thread here in a moment. And also joining us is John Gardner. John is the chair, CEO, and founder of the Gardner Institute for Excellence in Undergraduate Education. So he has spent decades as a leader in higher ed, studying everything from how students learn, success, retention, the first year experience, and holistically championing students from the moment they step foot on campus to when they leave. When John, read your bio, the two accolades that really made my heart sing were change agent and student advocate. So this is going to be a phenomenal conversation. I'm really excited to have you both here. Welcome.
Thank you, Deb.
Indeed, glad to be here.
So what I want to talk about today is the birth of a new consortium. And I'm wondering, John, if you can introduce us to the consortium and its origin story.
I certainly can. You're referring to the Tulsa, as in Oklahoma, Higher Education Consortium, which was formally approved just before the end of the last year in December. It is currently housed under another nonprofit organization, Impact Tulsa, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And it will, after getting formally started and at work, the plan is to spin it off as its own 501c3. Now, this is a consortium that brings together initially 7 post-secondary institutions, 1 community college, 1 private university, that's the University of Tulsa, 2 campuses of 2 universities, state university systems, the University of Oklahoma and Oklahoma State University, both of which have campuses in Tulsa, and 2 regional public universities, Northeastern State, Oklahoma, and Rogers State, Oklahoma, and 1 historically Black university, Langston University. And the community college, the 1 community college that by Oklahoma statute is the only authorized public provider of the first 2 years of baccalaureate level higher education in Tulsa. So you've got 1 community college that feeds students to 6 other institutions in the region. And representatives there have been, talking for a long time about ways to improve the movement of students from the community college to the 6 baccalaureate receiving institutions in the region, and not only moving them, but trying to help increase their success and degree attainment rates. And that's where the birth of this story gets connected to philanthropy, because it was a local philanthropist, or a representative of a philanthropy, that saw a way to make this happen. And this is an example of really creative philanthropy, where an experienced foundation program officer can work with people whom he or she is trying to serve, and to develop a vision for how to do that, in this case, in ways that hadn't been conceived of initially. So the local foundation in reference is the Charles and Lynn Schusterman Foundation, based in Tulsa with offices in their headquarters is in Tulsa, and they have an office in San Francisco and Tel Aviv, Israel. And they invest heavily in many activities to improve the quality of life in the Tulsa region. They're very interested in education. And the foundation was interested in some kind of investment that would assist transfer student outcomes because of who transfer students are, and because the Tulsa region has a significant proportion of lower income, underserved students that more typically become transfer students. Okay, so the program officer, though, the story ultimately comes down to one program officer, a gentleman by the name of Michael DuPont, who had been working with the 7 institutions there, a representative group that were responding to the foundation's interest in doing something to help them enhance transfer. And this is what I call a philanthropy activist. He's not like the proverbial frog that sits on his or her derriere waiting for the fly to come along and land on the tongue. And so he was actively trying to recruit parties that he could bring to bear to help his colleagues in the Tulsa region. And he was invited by another foundation, the Gates Foundation, to attend a meeting in Houston this would have been in March of 2018, a meeting about work that was being done in Houston funded by the Gates Foundation. But it was a work about making students in one region, namely the 4th largest city in the US, more successful, and Gates had been investing there. And the Gates Foundation had invited me to speak at this particular meeting, and it wasn't a major role, it was kind of a bit part. I was just one of a number of speakers. But this foundation officer, and the moral of the story in part is, when you're out speaking to people, you never know who's in the audience. So you better have your act together. And this gentleman was in the audience. I didn't know who was in the audience. And about 2 weeks later, he reached out to me. And this is Michael DuPont from the Schusterman Foundation. And he asked me if we could have a conversation about what the organization that I represent does to help the success of transfer students. And I said, of course. And so we had this conversation, and at the end of that, he invited me to submit a proposal to provide services to these 7 institutions that the Schusterman Foundation would fund. Now, he didn't make a commitment to invite us to do this work. It was clearly understood that we would be one of multiple parties that would in effect be competing to have the local group anoint whomever they wanted to work with. Mr. DuPont was not about to impose us on anybody else. That wouldn't have been his style. And so we thought this was worth doing. And we are a nonprofit higher education serving institution. We're going on 22 years old, and we're based in the East. We're based in North Carolina, where Vicki made the mistake to come and retire, and then she met me, or I met her, and entirely professionally speaking. And so anyway, we work with institutions all over the country, and we have a process. We've offered about 70 institutions in the United States to help them improve transfer. And this foundation program officer learned about that. All right, so we submitted a proposal. That proposal was largely authored by my colleague, Drew Koch from our institute. And anyway, the group out there, for whatever reasons, they chose us to be their external partner for this. So we spent 2 years working with 7 institutions, all of which was designed to produce for each of them, all 7, an action plan, either to improve the sending rate of students from a community college to baccalaureate level institutions, or the receiving process for students who join a baccalaureate level institution. You can't fix transfer in a region if you don't. You have to look at transfer as a comprehensive, holistic, life cycle spanning educational process. It's not just applying to another institution and getting your transcripts reviewed and articulated. You know, if you don't have any courses that you've earned credit for, you don't have anything to transfer. And when you transfer, if you don't earn more credit for courses, you don't have anything to show for it. So basically, it's about a comprehensive educational process. So we were working with these 7 institutions, and we were really having what looked like a lot of success, and there was a lot of interest, and these 7 institutions were really collaborating well. And at one point, this foundation officer said to me, "John, you know, this is really going so well. What could we do And what else could we do? How could we build on this? You know, foundations, relates to the question of why would a foundation be interested? They want to keep investing in success. They want to build momentum, all right? They want to leverage their investments. So here's a smart program officer, looks to him like he's getting some return on investment. And so he says, you know, how can we leverage this further? But further to your question, why would a foundation want to be interested in this, in what ultimately is a consortium? Because the idea became, you know, I said to Michael, one thing you could do is you could help them convert this one-time project, one and done work into something that could be sustained on a long-term basis, could take on a life of its own, become its own organization. And we have a name for that in American higher education. We call these consortia. And they've been around for the better part of a century, and they've got a long track record. He didn't know what a consortia was. He had no experience with this. And that's where I called upon my colleague, Dr. McGillin, who knows far more than I do about consortia. And we began educating him about a consortia. At that time, he secured the permission of his foundation to invest in stage 2 of this work. It was to work with 7 institutions in one geographic region to consider the creation of a consortium. And his foundation funded that work, the development process, okay? So that they could not use cost as an obstacle to not considering this. But the original vision was that this would be something that if the local community wanted to do this, that it would serve this particular community, that it would extend and institutionalize and make permanent and ongoing focus on increasing success of transfer students. And in addition, other collaborative activities that could be undertaken to advance higher education in the Tulsa region. And to do this collaboratively with other community players, everything from the mayor's office to the local chamber of commerce, to a prominent community-based foundation. All of those were designed by this philanthropist to be partners in this, okay? So as John Kennedy once so famously said, that disaster is an orphan and success has many parents. And he wanted to make sure there were lots of parents giving birth to this. So at that point, we called on Vicki to help lead our organization's work to help these 7 institutions think through what is a consortium? How would you design that? What are the questions you need to ask? How do you build this properly so that you're building something that has a high probability of being sustained? The outcome rapidly was that the 7 institutions came together. They approved a formal proposal coming out of this foundation project to approve the creation of a freestanding consortia, and the Schusterman Foundation has awarded a 2-year grant to fund all the startup activities of this consortium. They're funding the appointment of a director, office staff, launch, everything you would need to launch a consortium, so that the first job of the new founding executive director doesn't have to be, how are we going to keep the lights on? Okay, the electricity, the utilities are paid for. All right. So this is an example of institutional collaboration, the visionary thinking of one program officer who saw a need and wanted to find some additional ways to meet that need. Now that you asked me a simple question, now get Vicki to do the rest of the talking, because she's the expert on the consortium. All right.
It's such a wonderful story. I mean, the narrative arc, really, you've got all the right actors, you've got the protagonist, and even
they do.
That idea of what happens when you can't count on the money, and what the way that people start to hold in and perhaps don't think is visionary, what this vision is perhaps possible. A couple follow-up questions on that, and then Vicki, I'm excited to hear what it really means to nurture and build out the possibilities. So I'm hearing that there's kind of this perfect storm, that you've got this almost a policy context or a legislative context, and that you've got this one community college is serving. You've got an interested program officer. Tell me more about the interest of the institutions, so the leadership. How do you get them on board? Or were they already excited to do this and they were just looking for the right lightning to strike? But we're talking a lot of college presidents, a lot of boards. What was that relationship cultivation process like?
Well, those institutions already were fully aware of the the significance of having a prominent foundation based in Tulsa, that it showed previously a willingness to invest in higher education. These presidents are smart. They are privileged to have a prominent local investor like this. But further, Oklahoma as a state has not been generous through public appropriations to higher education. Resources are very, very scarce. And when you have an additional outside investor that's willing to do this, why wouldn't they be willing to look at that? As long as it didn't compromise the identity of any of these institutions. There was no threat here to merge these institutions or to create a new governance body that would impose a whole new bureaucratic structure on them. So essentially, it was how could you not win in some way? But the other self-interest here is that when you have two major research universities, one a land grant, one a comprehensive state system, both of which have campuses in this major city, they want more enrollments because they're operating. The University of Oklahoma and Oklahoma State are operating only as upper division institutions. The way they get students, the students have to be fed in from somewhere. And the community college is the logical feeder, the predominant feeder to do that. So their self-interest in growing their two locations in the Tulsa city of Tulsa proper are very much tied to their ability to recruit more transfer students. On the other hand, the Tulsa Community College, right now it has in effect a legislative monopoly to be the sole provider of the first 2 years in Tulsa County. All right, if it can't produce an adequate number of students completing the first 2 years, the people are going to go to the state and say, you have to give us some other options to produce the first 2 years of college. So Tulsa Community College, for its own long-term viability, has to be even more successful with the students in its associate degree programs. The other 3-4 institutions here, you have a private university. Private universities increasingly, as Dr. McGillian can tell you better than I, have become much more receptive to transfers. Often it's the private universities and colleges that are the most receptive to transfer students because it is replacing a lot of the students that they've lost to community colleges, for example. And in general, all of these institutions are funded on a public formula based on enrollment. And so they're all interested in recruiting more students. So this is a marriage of mutual self-interests, institutional self-interests that are one and the same with the self-interests of the region. You also have a dark chapter of local history. And, we're only learning now about the dark chapters that are in so many places in our country that over the course of the last century have had events take place, which many of us would rather forget or sweep under the rug, that developed a culture to suppress advancement and opportunity for minorities. And in 1921, you had this extraordinary massacre by white citizens of Tulsa residents, of Black residents. And this has had a huge long-term impact on this community. And so anything that is a further step to increase equitable outcomes in a community with this kind of history, which some people there remember more than others, but it is a cloud. And but all of this, is looking towards a more positive future. So I think it was just a case where everybody would win. There was no necessity to cultivate these presidents. They all realized how this was to the advantage of everybody.
And that idea of aligning self-interest, some people, when they first hear about collaboration or consortial work, they're like, oh no, we should all just do together because it's the fun thing to do, or it's the right thing to do.
No, it's the American male thing to do. Let's turn it all into a football field, okay, where we have a zero-sum games and they're losers and winners.
Right,
and
as opposed to
got across here is everybody's a winner. Everybody, the community, the students, the 7 institutions.
Yeah, and I love that the community is one of the characters here. It's not just these little, nodes of institutions that connect, but that those connections are very much embedded and thrive within that community context.
Yeah, I neglected one other player, and that was unintentional. The state Board of Regents, the Oklahoma board, they wanted very much to be able to participate, but not to attempt to influence in any guiding policy way. And they lent 3 of their staff members to offer us assistance, including one data expert. So they were encouraging. As a matter of fact, their CEO met with our consortium participants and indicated that, in a state that doesn't have enough state resources to expand higher education opportunities, that the state regents felt that a consortium model was definitely in order. So not only did they not oppose it, they were encouraging of it. And thanks to Dr. McGillin, she did the research to find out that the other player that could have been a player, but now didn't have to be, was the regional accreditor, the Higher Learning Commission, because they had no bureaucratic potential impediments that would have prevented these institutions from doing this. Right, Vicki? And Vicki's, thoroughly checking this out and helping us get a green light on that. That was also very instrumental.
So I think, Vicki, this is a good moment to transition to you and talk about the nurturing of these relationships. And so a couple things elevate right away. That this was an over 2-year long engagement. So this is not something you sweep in as like, let's run a workshop and we'll design a whole new consortium. So walk me through the process of developing it, how you were involved. What were the other, the idea that you were looking for potential barriers, seeing if it was possible to remove them, looking for other potential partners to augment. Walk me through your thought process. What questions are you asking? Who are you engaging? How?
I think the first and most critical step was pulling together the right stakeholders. And of course, each institution named their own representatives to the planning group. So there wasn't an issue of any control over that. It was just encouraging the institutions to send representatives who actually had a voice, who were not just serving as messengers back and forth between the planning body. So each of the institutional teams sent probably about 5 to 6 individuals from each institution to be a part of this larger planning group. The city, as mentioned, had representatives from the mayor's office. The Chamber of Commerce was represented, particularly on the steering committee as well, because this was about creating a regional consortia that was to serve a region and to meet a region's needs. So having the mayor's office, having the Chamber of Commerce, and having Impact Tulsa as a part of the planning body ensured that people who were already on the ground and literally in the streets of Tulsa were there contributing to the birth of this particular initiative. We gave some thought to the organizational structure, what kind of planning groups were needed. There was a need for a steering committee, obviously, to oversee the guidance of this process, but we created working groups that included one group that was working on mission and learning outcomes and strategic initiatives, another group that was working on what data was going to be called for, what kind of data sharing, a group that was focusing on the student experience because it was critical to include that, and a group that focused on the governance structure. And each of these groups was charged with taking a look at the national scene, taking a look at other regional models, other examples, and coming back with a set of proposals. It was an exciting process. We did some work with the whole body in terms of educating them about consortia. We provided a summary document that one of my colleagues, Dr. Monica Flippin-Wynn, developed, where she summarized profiles of about 7 or 8 different consortia so that they could take a look at how they were structured and organized. And we also spent a little bit of time talking about what I have come to think of as sort of the 4 competing forces that you need to consider right at the start. When I began to work with the Ohio institutions and I called up consortial leaders from around the country, I heard from a number of them about the importance of balancing what they thought were the 2 critical elements, pain and trust, and that how much pain are you in that will lead your institution to consider building a partnership with another institution, and how much can you trust the other institutions in that process. But as I thought about it more, it was also about balancing identity and mission. Could the consortia create a compelling mission that would be sufficient to move all of the institutions forward, to say, yes, this is what we are all about. This is how we are all serving the Tulsa region. This is what we can do together to make this better for all of our students. At the same time, balancing out your individual institution's critical need for your identity to not be tampered with, and for that to feel safe, that you are the University of Tulsa. Nothing is going to change that, but you have an added identity because you are now also a part of the consortium, the Tulsa Higher Education Consortium. So we spent some time having those conversations up front first, and then broke into our working groups with the mission and learning outcomes, the outcomes mission strategic planning group, really having to take the lead, because pretty much what we decided would set the tone for the other groups as they did their work. We brought in speakers from the Association for Collaborative Leadership, panelists from leaders of consortia, from around the United States, regional consortia and other mission-based consortia, to really talk about how their consortia were formed and what matters and what mattered in terms of governance and such. And I think those panels were very, very important for the whole process, because the individual committee members kept referring back to, well, this person said, and this person said. It created a momentum for the work that they were doing, because they were seeing viable options. And we chose consortia that were also relatively new, but also others that had been around for 20 some years, so that they could have a sense of the kind of the arc of the development of those consortia and what it took. But moving forward, the mission committee created a mission that was voted on by the entire body of stakeholders after extensive discussion. It was also communicated out right away to the presidents to let them know, this is what we're looking at. Speak now. If you see something here that is frightening you in any way, let us know. But they were alerted to what we were seeing as the mission for this emerging entity that we were creating, and then began to work on outcomes and what were some of the strategies that could lead that. What would be the nature of the student experience across, between and amongst the institutions, what data needs were going to be critical, because it was also very clear that the early work on creating this transfer partnership was a primary initiative for all of the institutions. They truly, truly wanted to ensure that that primacy didn't get lost in the midst of getting excited about other kinds of collaborations. Let's make sure that staying the course with this transfer collaboration is a primary part of that initiative. And the governance body that was co-chaired by Dr. Betsy Barefoot from the Gardner Institute as well, looked at various different governance structures and ultimately made their recommendations. All of this then came forward. Each of the chunks were ultimately voted on and agreed upon by the overall stakeholders body. When we felt we had the final package, it was then ready to send back to the institutions with the endorsement. What was particularly powerful, I think, was it was also at that moment that Michael DuPont also announced that the Schusterman Foundation was prepared to fund this for 2 years, so that the institutions didn't have to worry about finding the money to make it work, to get it going. They could put it into next year or the year after's budget without having to worry about finding the money right away, so that it came forward to the institutions as a package. Here is mission, vision, strategies, governance structures, student process, data sharing, and funding to move this particular idea forward.
And as you're talking, I'm just standing in awe, because one of the questions when you started to tell this part of the story is, in my mind, I'm thinking, holy smokes, that's a very large group of people. So 5 to 6 people from 7 institutions plus community stakeholders. And what was on my mind is, how in the heck do you get momentum in a group that large? But then what you're sharing and what elevates for me is there was a lot of information sharing and model sharing and question asking, and then dividing out the different tasks and figuring out what the individual groups could do. I'm curious. So Vicki, you were high touch for a couple years on this. How did you go about balancing both this, I need to be a facilitator and move this process forward, but this is actually not my thing to create, that I'm helping the others create that, and kind of that feels like its own tension. And I'm curious how that worked out for you, and just how you navigated that.
Well, for this, I would give great credit to the selection of the chairs and co-chairs of each of the individual working groups, because we in particular in the mission outcomes and strategy working group had a particularly gifted leader from Tulsa Community College who took the initiative. And we saw that happening in each of the individual working groups, was that the leadership on the ground was willing to take the initiative. And for this, I also credit 2 years of working together on transfer collaboration gave them a comfort with each other and a beginning trust with each other that I think was part of the secret sauce that really helped this take off.
Yeah, and just and I won't say staging sounds too deliberate, but the sequencing of this, and including the magnificent moment where Mr. DuPont says, actually, there's funding for 2 years, right at the moment where decision makers could have said, great idea, but we're not going to be able to be a part of that. We have some budgetary concerns. I'm curious now, looking to the future. So what happens next? We should mention that you're in the process of hiring the inaugural executive director. Do you want to tell us a bit about that position, give a shout out, to invite some applicants, but then also talk about what that transition into the future looks like for the consortium?
Well, the Impact Tulsa, who is serving as, not Impact Tulsa, the Tulsa Community Foundation, do I have the name right there, John? Yes, the Tulsa Community Foundation is serving as the umbrella organization in the initial years for this particular consortium. They are hosting the search. So the search is on their webpage, the search announcement. I know that they're moving forward with interviews. So there may still be the opportunity for individuals interested to apply, but they are looking specifically for individuals who can bring the experience of both higher education, but also if they've had experience with consortia or collaborative initiatives, that will be a particularly important part of the formula for what they're looking for. They were initially explicitly privileging experience in the Tulsa region, but they have opened it up to individuals who can just bring this kind of knowledge and wisdom to the search process itself. They are moving forward where the Gardner Institute is now. We're just sort of the proud, godparents. We're waiting for the official birth announcement and such.
I have the word midwife in mind.
I'm just going to use that metaphor, even though my gender kind of gives me some cognitive dissonance on that. But yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so what happens next? So what is the future? And I should say, we'll be sure to put the link to that job description in the show notes. That way, if there is still a possibility of people getting involved, they'll be able to do that. But what do you hope for the future of the consortium?
Well, I have two hopes. They set out an amazingly ambitious set of outcomes and strategies a wish list for any consortial organization, I can say, that there was such excitement about. So my greatest wish is that, that they are moving forward with their strategies that they want to implement thoughtfully and systematically, with the goal of being able to gain some early wins, because they are going to have to go to the presidents in 2 years and say, okay, now it's time to start ponying up with the membership. Let's turn this into a paying experience. So it's important for them to have some early wins as an organization. I also hope that they are willing to share their experience, because the birth of regional, particularly urban consortia, is, I think, a critical part of the future of American higher education. We are seeing so many institutions who are struggling financially, struggling in terms of enrollment, and seeking ways to survive without actually having to change anything that they're doing. And of course, there is no magic formula for that. But this is the closest formula to be able to maintain a sense of institutional identity while building a collaborative structure and serving your regional community at the same time. I can't think of any better future for American higher education.
That's beautiful. I think that's a good one to end on. But John, I'm curious too if you have some closing thoughts here.
Well, on the what's next, I would hope that the one of the original hopes for this consortium will be realized, which is to maintain as not the, but a major focus on institutionalizing efforts to improve transfer. I hope they don't walk away from that. I can't imagine that they would. They know that needs to be sustained. But after that, you have to find other things you agree on would be shared interests where everybody wins. And it's very important to get the faculty involved from these 7 institutions to see what kinds of academic initiatives a consortium might be able to sponsor that individually they wouldn't have the resources or the staffing to launch, but with this as a midwife, they could do. So some coming together on consensus around some other activities they could undertake. And as Vicki said, they need some early wins. Nothing succeeds like success. So you don't want to pick off the most difficult challenge in the community and make that the one to start with. You really don't. And that's not what they're doing. I think they're going about this very wisely. And they know they've got a very important investor who's looking over their shoulder and who could also help them network with other potential investors. And I think that this is a community that lost out. Tulsa was being considered as a location for the expansion of the Tesla Corporation. And they didn't get that. Tesla went somewhere else. And I think it's contributing to having them ask, what does it take to attract national external parties to want to invest in our community? And the Chamber of Commerce several years ago took a team from Tulsa to look at Columbus, Ohio, as a city that they think is doing a lot of things right to promote economic development. And of course, one of the central attributes of the Columbus region is Vicki's former employment base, which is very vital, multiple private institutions, as well as one of the great flagship research universities of the United States. So the interconnection between higher education and local individual growth, all the indicators are in the 08 recession, and then again in the pandemic, the communities that have come through this the best are the ones that have very deep higher education resources. I'm not thinking in terms of one variable here, but those are some of my hopes. And I maybe there's some risk in myself, but I'm going to say this anyway. I'm thinking back on all the people that we had involved in this work. And as so often happens to me in the work we do, I ask myself, where are the men? Because disproportionately, the representatives on these teams and the leadership roles were being assumed by women. And thank goodness for them, really. And even the team from the Gardner Institute, my gender was underrepresented. And so this says something to me about how things do get done, and we need to have more getting done in the 21st century.
It's a beautiful note.
I said that, Vicki didn't.
Yeah, a beautiful note to end on. And I'll just say, obviously, thank you for the work you're doing to nurture these interinstitutional relationships and these collaborations, but also thank you for having this vantage point where you're able to both recognize the story, but also tell it with such compassion and care and nuance to all of the pieces and parts as they're moving, because I really do think those stories are what will open up possibilities for others who are turning to the consortium as a model for how to do this, but also looking to other consortial leaders, looking to you all to say, wow, how do you get your people, your tools, and your processes pulling in the same direction? So it's really such a lovely story. I'm honored that you shared it with us today on my.
Vicki, again, thanks to Vicki, we want to be more connected to the work of the Association for Collaborative Learning. And we think consortial leaders currently could do more to encourage and recruit future consortium leaders, and that we hope that current consortial leaders will be, how shall I say this, Vicki, even more willing to share this model and to try to spawn the next generation of consortial leaders and people who are willing to attempt to create new consortia. The time the higher education is really open to new models. They found during the pandemic an awful lot didn't work and wasn't working for all kinds of people who weren't getting a fair share. And a consortia is a way to call attention to some elements of lack of equity in a community that need more attention.
Yeah, when it's clear we can't go business as usual. And I think consortial structures are a way forward to make this work. Okay, well, thank you both so much for the conversation. I'll talk to you soon.